Today, I want to talk about the fire hardening and defensible space advisory, disclosure, advisory, and addendum. I think it's advisory, disclosure, and addendum. And the proper use of that and when it's appropriate to use and what the requirements are under the defensible space and fire hardening regulations that currently exist. Those regulations are going to change in another year or two. So let's talk about the FHDS, and then afterwards, Lindsay's going to monitor for questions. If you have any questions, you can put them in the chat or you can ask them at the end of the first part of this session. If time allows, I want to touch on 2 or 3 tips that have come up more than a few times, and I want to sort of bring you up to speed on a few things that might save you some problems in your transactions. So this form accomplishes 3 things, all on 2 pages. And so in some ways it causes a little bit of confusion, but in other ways it does it very, very nicely. So we'll go through this form in detail. It's a 2-page form, as most of you know. Most of you have probably seen this form, and many of you have probably used it already. So you're probably familiar with it somewhat. So the first thing I want to point out is it is an advisory and a disclosure and an addendum all at the same time. Various parts of the form function as either an advisory, a disclosure, or an addendum to the purchase agreement. If it's not included with the purchase agreement, I'm recommending that a seller counter this form in a counter offer, especially if you're generating a counter offer. And again, only when appropriate. We'll talk about when it's required to use this form in a moment. But if the fire hardening and defensible space advisory, disclosure, and addendum, if the property qualifies for fire hardening and defensible space disclosures and addendums, then you would add this form to your transaction. Because it has an addendum as part of it, it requires an agreement by the buyer and the seller. So in most instances, one would assume the seller and the buyer would come to an agreement. In some instances, you might be halfway through a transaction, then you provide this form and the buyer doesn't agree. And if the buyer doesn't agree, then you might not be able to close escrow. And in fact, because this law is part of 1102, the buyer, even if he's waived all his contingencies, if he doesn't agree to what's on this form, he can cancel and get his deposit back 5 days after getting his form. So that's why sellers highly recommend you make it as part of a counter offer. If it's not done as part of the offer, then when it is provided, of course, it would be provided as an advisory, disclosure, and addendum to the purchase agreement. All right, so let's take a look at it. It's divided into 2 parts. At the top of the form, paragraphs 1 through 3 are fire hardening portions of the form, and then the balance of the form is a defensible space. So it first functions as an advisory. So the law applicability, fire hardening disclosures are required. There's the information in paragraph 3 of this form must be provided to a buyer. And we're going to talk about paragraph 3 in detail in a moment, but that's paragraph 3. It has the statutory notice that is required to provide a buyer, and it has a place where the seller can disclose vulnerabilities of the property to fire if the seller is aware of it. So that fire hardening portion of this disclosure is required for sellers of residential properties that contain 1 to 4 units constructed before January 1st of 2010. The rationale there is starting in January of 2010, the building codes changed to provide for a lot of the things that this fire hardening disclosure discloses. They're already part of a property now if your property is built after 2010. But if it was built prior to 2010, many of the features that would make a property less susceptible to wildfire fires were not part of the construction. So that's why it's required for properties built prior to 2010. And of course, located in either a high or very high fire hazard severity zone. And then finally, only if a seller is required to provide a transfer disclosure statement. So what does this tell you off right at the beginning? Well, first of all, this form is not required for land. So if you're doing a land transaction, this form is not required. Also, if the seller is an exempt seller from the TDS, this form is not required. So probates do not require this form. Successor trustees do not require this form. So if a person is exempt from a TDS, then this is not required. And of course, it's only required for properties that are, like I said, 1 to 4 units and built before 2010 and then located in a high or very high fire zone. Defensible space compliance, very similar, but not an exact duplicate. Disclosures are required the disclosures and requirements specified in paragraph 4 are required. And in paragraph 4, we'll talk about that in detail, but they talk about the defensible space advisory and then the defensible space compliance, which covers 5 subparagraphs. And we'll go through those in detail. That is where a lot of the confusion using this form comes in. So this is required for sellers of, again, residential properties containing 1 to 4 units located in a high or very high fire hazard severity zone. And once again, also if the seller is required to provide a transfer disclosure statement. So again, if the seller is exempt from a TDS, then they're also exempt not only from fire hardening disclosures, but from defensible space compliance disclosures. Now, if you look at the two together, you'll notice that they're very similar. Both contain 1 to 4 units. Yes, okay. Both if located in a high or very high fire zone. And then finally, both required if a TDS is required. Where the difference exists is that if a property was built after January 1st, the fire hardening portion of this form is in fact not required. So if you had a property that was built 4 years ago, you could conceivably not fill out the top of this form and you would be fine because it's not required. The property was built after January 1st of 2010. No such time limit exists for the defensible space compliance. Why? Because you're talking about the features of the surrounding land of the property and has nothing to do with when the property was constructed. So if these other 3 requirements or features exist, 1 to 4 units in a high or very high fire zone, fire hazard severity zone, and a TDS is required, then you would do a defensible space compliance, which is the bottom half of this form. And then finally, the inspection report, including fire hardening and defensible space compliance, the disclosure of a final inspection report obtained under the specifications of paragraph 5, and we'll talk about that in detail in a moment, is also, is only required of sellers of residential properties 1 to 4 units where a TDS is required. However, any seller may be required to provide such a report pursuant to disclosing material facts. So if a seller had such a report, regardless of the status of the property, they should provide the report. You're not going to see a lot of sellers with reports yet, but over time, more and more will have them, and it'll become more and more of a feature. This will become more important to you. Where reports may exist is in getting building permits. Most of the jurisdictions, most of the building departments throughout the state require a defensible space compliance inspection as part of a building permit. And so a seller who might be otherwise exempt from having to provide the report would have one pursuant to them having improved their property, nothing to do with selling their property, but like the slide says, the fact that they have a report is a material fact, and they would have to provide that report. They should provide that report. Okay, where do you locate information about the fire hardening? Well, a seller has an obligation to determine if compliance with fire hardening and defensible space requirements are applicable to the seller. So it may be possible to determine if the seller has a property in a high or very high fire zone by consulting the natural hazard zone disclosure and or talking to the company and or reviewing the report. They can consult with your representative, ask them outright if you're confused by viewing the report or viewing the report to see if they're in a high or very high fire zone. Where it gets confusing is that the natural hazard report companies haven't quite caught up with the civil code. And so they report very high fire hazard severity zones up front in the summary page. They also report wildfire zones. And the problem with that is a wildfire zone may be a moderate fire hazard zone or a high fire hazard zone. So you often have to go into the body of the report to see if it's moderate or high. Or you might even err on the side of caution. Even if a property is not in either zone, a seller might be unable to determine whether the property is in one of those zones. But because it's in a mountainous area, a forest-covered area, or some kind of rural area, they might choose to make those disclosures because the buyer might feel it material. So a buyer can make the disclosures contained in paragraph 3B, which is, we're going to talk about that in a minute. Whether they're required by law or not, they can voluntarily make those disclosures. Or also they can make the disclosures, their compliance to defensible space law. They can detail that in paragraph 4B as well, and they can do that voluntarily, even if not mandated by law. So my recommendation is, when in doubt, go ahead and provide the form and fill it out to the best of the seller's ability. It's the safest route to take. The only downside to providing this form is that it does carry a non-rescindable right of rescission. So how do you avoid that? Provide this form up front or within the first few days of a transaction. You're supposed to provide it within 7 days. And so you do that up front, and the 5-day right of rescission that kicks in once this form is delivered may well be within their normal contingency period that the contract contains anyway. So you're not taking any risk. Providing this form late in the transaction, or even worse, after contingencies have been removed, would reinstate a buyer's right to cancel the transaction and get their deposit back, regardless of contingencies that they may or may not have removed. So no downside to providing this form unless you're providing it late. If you're providing it late and you're required to provide it, you still have to provide it. If you're providing it late but you're not required to provide it, that might be why you pass on doing that. Okay, so now let's look at paragraph 2, the fire severity zone. So the form defaults to the fact that the home is in a high or very high fire hazard zone. And of course, you're probably filling out this form because you've determined that by reviewing the natural hazard disclosure. So you don't have to check anything. If you do check anything, you would check the box. The home is not in a high or very high fire hazard zone, but you're providing the form anyway as a voluntary gesture. So here's a consideration. In real estate law, if you can only sue if you're damaged. So you might not be happy, you might be mad, but if you don't have material damage, you don't like the seller was rude to you, or they didn't clean the house after they left it, or something, and you're upset. You'd have to show damages, material damages, to bring a lawsuit. Now, why am I going on about that? Because if you inadvertently declared that it was in a high or very high fire zone, in other words, you did not check this box, even though it's not in a high or high fire zone, high or very high fire hazard zone, I have a hard time figuring out what the buyer's damages would be. Gee, my house is worth less because it's not in a zone, and you told me it was. Gee, I like to live on the edge, and I want to sell to people who like to live on the edge, and I thought it was in a high fire zone because you said it was, and it turns out it's not. So what am I saying? What I'm saying is, I would not necessarily check this box, even if you think it's not, just to be safe, because it's hard sometimes to prove what's not true. It's easy to prove what is true. It's easy to see, oh yeah, it's in a high fire zone or a very high fire hazard zone, but you might miss that and think it's not, but it is. You check not. When it is, in fact, in a very high fire zone, you could be opening up a little bit of a can of worms. So my recommendation is, even when you're providing this, when you're not sure or you don't think you need to, but you want to, you can provide it without checking this box, because a buyer would have an almost impossible chance of proving damages. Now, the one concern you might have is it might alert or upset the buyer to a point he doesn't want to proceed with the transaction. So that might be a discussion you have with the other agent. All right. So fire hardening disclosure only required to be completed if the criteria in 1A1 are met. We covered that. So the paragraph 3 in A and B are only required if, remember this, the property is 1 to 4 units, constructed before January 1st, 2020, located in a high or very high fire zone, and a TDS is required. So if that is true, then you must provide this, and you must provide this statutory notice. So here it is. It's right there in writing. This is exactly what civil code says the buyer must be told. So CAR, of course, puts it right on the form for you, including providing the website that civil code says the buyer must be provided. It's right there. The civil code also says that the seller must disclose known vulnerabilities. So if the seller is aware of vulnerabilities, they must disclose it. The key word is aware. So one of the first challenges that you're going to have in filling out this form is that many of your sellers are not going to be aware of some of these things. And so this form, you only check what you're aware of. And the fact that you don't check it does not mean, those of you who represent buyers, does not mean these things might not exist. What it means is the seller's not aware of it. So keep that in mind. So you check all that apply. So the form allows you to check each one. So even soffit roof ventilations where vents or openings are in excess of 1/8 of an inch in size, or not flame and ember resistant. So if you have such a thing, roof ventilation on your roof, I would argue a lot of sellers aren't going to know about this. Roof coverings made of untreated wood shingles or shakes. I would argue most sellers probably know they do have shake roofs if they still have such a roof. So that one might be an easy one for them to check if they know it's true. Combustible landscaping within 5 feet of the house. Or under the elevated deck. Most sellers are going to know that, so they should be able to answer that accurately. Again, single pane windows, some sellers will, a few sellers may not know. Roofs are missing bird stoppings or roof flashings. There's one most sellers won't have a clue about. So that might not be checked. And again, that doesn't mean that doesn't exist. They're checking what they're aware of. Gutters without metal or non-combustible gutter covers. Now, you check all that apply. So it's possible you check 3 things. You could check all 6 if you knew them. But, the ones that I say that the sellers are going to be most aware of having are these 3. So you may see a form with these 3 checked. Most sellers will probably be able to be aware of that. All right. So that concludes the fire hardening portion of this form. Fire hardening, very straightforward. The new law I referenced early in the presentation is going to address fire hardening in more detail. So, rest assured, the assembly is going to be sure to make that fire hardening more complicated. But right now, it's very straightforward. Where the confusion exists with the new law, fire hardening and defensible space, is a defensible space requirements. So we're going to talk about that. So defensible space requirements. Again, defensible space requirements are only required to be met if the criteria in 1A2 are met. And we talked about 1A2 at the beginning, the law applicability, defensible space compliance. So 1 to 4 units, residential units, located in a high or very high fire hazard zone, severity zone, and a transfer disclosure statement is required. Again, it has nothing to do with the age of the structure. So that does not enter into it. But if these 3 things are all in place, then you're required to make your defensible space compliance disclosure. All right. All 3 have to be in place, by the way. You could have land that's in a high or very high fire zone, and this disclosure would not be required because all 3 must be part of the situation. Okay. Defensible space advisory, they talk about Civil Code 4291, where they discuss, maintaining a sort of a defensible space around a property within 100 feet. Certain things have to be at least 30 feet away. I've mentioned this in previous seminars. For example, firewood. If you have firewood and you're in a high or very high fire zone, the law requires you to store your firewood 30 feet from your structure. But the land, the ground covering and the trees and the vegetation, that's within 100 feet of the structure. The question that always comes up is, what if it's a condominium? Well, if it's a condominium, then it's the condominium that's responsible for it because they own the common areas, not the seller. So if it's a condominium, that's that you still have to make these disclosures, but you may not be required to maintain a 100-foot radius. A second question that comes up is my lot line ends 50 feet away from my house, and my neighbor is responsible for the next 50 feet. The law does say, it ends where your property line ends. So if your property line ends before you get to that 100-foot perimeter line, then you're not responsible. So kind of common sense questions, but answers they do come up from time to time. Okay. Now, many local governments, and that includes San Diego County, the city of San Diego, the city of Escondido, have all enacted local vegetation management ordinance. And as I'm going to discuss in a moment, that does not necessarily compel a seller to get an inspection. We're going to get into this in a little bit. But the fact is, there are local ordinances in San Diego County, including a county ordinance and the 2 cities. I didn't check the South Bay cities, but I checked the cities that we do most of our work in. I didn't check Vista. I probably should, by the way, or Oceanside, maybe. I think I will do that for you. All right. Now, effective July 1st, the Civil Code 1102 requires a disclosure regarding compliance with defensible space for certain specified properties. And we talked about those properties. So defensible space compliance, it's 4B is the section of this form that's going to cause you the most discussion and maybe the most concern, although it shouldn't cause you a lot of concern. Hopefully after this seminar, it won't. Don't hesitate to call me if you do have questions. The boilerplate is that paragraph B1 applies. Notice there's no checkbox in front of B1 unless either 2, 3, or 4 is checked. And so you have 4 options. So let me give you an overview of defensible space law, and it might help put this in perspective a little bit. You can think of the defensible space law as 3 tiers of the law. The law has, you could argue, 3 tiers. The first tier is it is currently a law for every single property that is in a high or very high fire zone to maintain defensible space. That is civil code. That is the county ordinance. That's the city ordinance. So I personally live in a very high fire zone. So the law requires me to maintain defensible space. That's tier 1. Every single property in the state of California that is in a high or very high fire zone is affected by the defensible space law. I'm supposed to go out and clear the weeds if I have any. I don't, by the way. I live in a residential area, but it's in Scripps Ranch, and it's real close on the edge of a canyon, and it's very high fire zone. And like I mentioned before, where it did affect me was it affected my firewood. My insurance company required me to move my firewood. My insurance company also pointed out I have two great big old trees side by side, but they let me off the hook. They told me I didn't have to chop them both down. But the law would say I do, because the trees have to be 10 feet apart. They were concerned about the branches of these big old trees hanging over my roof and being too close to my chimney. Well, they weren't that close, but the picture they got from the inspector made them look close. So what am I going on about? I'm going on about the fact that Tier 1, all of us who own property in high or very high fire zones are required to maintain defensible space. Whether we do that or not, that's up to you. It's up to you and your insurance company. Maybe your neighbors, I don't know. That's Tier 1. Tier 2 is if you are a buyer or a seller. If you are a buyer or a seller, the 1102 in July 1st of last year was modified that said either a buyer or a seller must document that you are in compliance. Now, don't get ahead of me yet, because that is the law. A buyer or a seller must document that you are in compliance. Now, the law allows that the seller does not have to document it prior to selling the property. They can transfer that responsibility to the buyer unless a local ordinance requires a point of sale documentation. And this is where agents who call me, and I probably get a couple of calls a week on this question. And this is what I stress. There is no point of sale requirement. And so as you're going to see in a moment, the seller can shift that documentation requirement onto the buyer. Of course, the buyer would have to accept it. And if the buyer didn't accept it, you might not be able to proceed with your transaction. So that goes back to why I'm recommending you make this form part of your counteroffer process to eliminate any debate. Tier 3 exists where there is a local ordinance because there is no state ordinance. It is not part of 1102 that you must make that documentation in order to sell your house. Now, the reason I sort of get on my soapbox here and sort of sound like I'm lecturing, forgive me for having this tone. The fire entities throughout the state, including the local San Diego Fire Department, they don't believe that. They believe 1102 says in order to sell your house, you have to have an inspection. They have it on their website. They have it on their forms. Yesterday, I confirmed that is not part of the civil code. It is not part of the City of San Diego code. So if you're selling a house in the City of San Diego or the County of San Diego, in the City of Escondido, you can shift the requirement to document that the property is in compliance with defensible space to the buyer. And this 4B allows you to do that. So 4B1 says there's no local ordinance that requires proof of compliance with defensible space laws. See, I do not have to prove I'm in compliance with the law. There's nothing in the civil code that says Walt needs to go get an inspection. I have no intention of selling my house. At the current time, I'm not. And so I don't have to do that. 1102 says that if I sell it, either the seller or the buyer must obtain documentation. The buyer can obtain documentation within 1 year of close of escrow. The seller can obtain it before he sells it if he wants to, or if he's required to by a local ordinance. Again, we don't have such a local ordinance. So that's why B1 is going to be the default right now. There is no local ordinance to my knowledge, and I'm going to keep an eye on this, and I'll get the word out if it ever changes. So in your transactions in San Diego County, B1 will probably apply most of the time. If you have any questions on that, we'll cover it. Lindsay will make a note of it and we'll talk about it. Okay. So now B2 might apply. B2 might apply. Why would B2 apply? Well, let me go back and talk about B1. I'm kind of rambling on. No local ordinance requiring proof of compliance. The buyer shall obtain documentation within 1 year close of escrow. That's part of 1102. And this requirement applies if there is a state or local agency or entity or nonprofit entity that can do inspections. Right now, they're starting to ramp that up. When this law was passed, they didn't have a lot of entities that could do inspections. So this last clause may not be that germane. Okay. Now let's look at B2. There is no local ordinance, but the seller within the last 6 months had gotten compliance. That's when I'd mentioned before, maybe I put a room addition on my house. I didn't. But if I did, and I did that recently, the building department would have probably required me to document that I'm in compliance with defensible space. And so if I did that in the previous 6 months, I've got a report, then I would check box 2 and provide that to the buyer. And so, again, no local ordinance requiring me to prove the compliance with defensible space, but the sellers voluntarily obtained the documentation. Why? Because they got a building permit. Or I could have, if I'd taken it seriously enough, I could have called up the CAL FIRE and asked them to come on out and inspect my house. My insurance company's giving me a hard time, and I'm thinking they're being overzealous. In fact, it was the reverse. My insurance company waived a few things that are in the civil code or in the 1102, like I said, 2 big old trees too close to each other, but they didn't care. So, but if I had a report, the inspector probably would have pointed out your 2 trees are within about 3 feet of each other. That's not good. Okay, the seller shall deliver that documentation to the buyer within 7 days of acceptance. All right, so no problem with 1 or 2. Where there might be a little issue is when you get to 3. There's a local vegetation management ordinance in effect, and the buyer shall obtain documentation of compliance with that defensible space. And if the law allows either the buyer or the seller to obtain documentation, 1102 allows either the buyer or the seller to obtain documentation. The city and county defers to 1102, so the seller or the buyer can obtain documentation. So when you represent a buyer, you should be sure that the buyer understands that 1102 does require that you may have to get an inspection within a year of closing escrow. The buyer shall comply with the ordinances if such an ordinance exists. Well, there are no local ordinances. The local ordinance defers to 1102, the state law. So you're not going to check 2 probably at all. And you're probably not going to check 4. 4 is there is a local vegetation management ordinance in effect, and the seller shall provide documentation. Why? Because the ordinance requires the seller to prove that they are in compliance prior to close of escrow. Again, depending on where your house is, if your house is in Truckee, you're going to be checking 4 every single time. Why? Because Truckee requires, prior to selling a property, that you have a report saying that you're in compliance with defensible space. Not unreasonable, given all the problems Truckee has had with wildfires. I am somewhat surprised the city of San Diego and the county of San Diego doesn't have a similar ordinance, because we've certainly had our fair share of problems. And they haven't been minor. The values of our properties are higher than Truckee. So, we haven't had as severe a problem as Truckee, perhaps, but we've had some pretty high-end, high-value losses. Insurance companies are not writing, in lots of locations in San Diego County because of it. So this could change. So I'm gonna monitor that. If anybody on this call discovers, hey, I was told there is an ordinance, Walt, just, you don't need to research it. I'll do it. Right now, if you're told, I'd like to know, give me a call and I'll research it for you. But yesterday I went on all the websites yesterday. I could find no ordinance. I had a conversation with the chief or assistant chief of compliance for the fire department in the city of San Diego. And he believed, or she believed it was part of 1102. I politely told her it was not. She said she was going to check on it. I've not talked to her since. It is not. I confirmed it is not part of 1102. In other words, that the seller must do it to sell his house. I confirmed that with Car Legal yesterday, and they said no, Walt. There is no requirement in 1102 that the seller must do it. So 4 does not apply in our area. It could in the future. I have seen not a lot, but a handful of agents from other companies telling our agents, oh no, 4 applies. You have to get that. Because why? Because the city has a form that says you have to do it to sell your house. And like I said, when I challenged the city about it, they said they'd get back to me. Okay. Hopefully I haven't created a can of worms here, but have helped clarify it. I will keep you informed. I mean, if your seller wanted to get the inspection, I suppose I wouldn't argue with it. Some of our sellers have gotten it, and there's nothing wrong with doing it. But now, once you get the inspection, you might be required to spend the dollars to bring the property into compliance. You might also be stuck with how long will it take for the report to get to you. It might impact your close of escrow. So you would complicate your transaction slightly if you checked, if you did, go ahead and get an inspection. But I'm not telling you not to, by all means. I'm just saying you're not required to by any applicable code in the county of San Diego that I'm aware of. All right. Finally, let's look at paragraph 5. If 2 or 4 is checked, then the local agency that provided the documentation is named, and and how you can contact them. And then finally, a final inspection report only required if 1A, the criterion 1A is met. And again, 1A says that you are a residential property and that a TDS is required. 4 units residential and a TDS is required. You may want to provide it because the civil code also says all material facts must be provided. The SPQ says you have to provide it. So again, if you have such a report, please provide it. And then you attach a copy of the report or where a copy of the report can be obtained at. All right. Now, the seller represents that the seller, to the best of their knowledge, is answering this form, is true and correct to the best of their knowledge, and they're agreeing to the applicable terms of 4B. And 4B, the term they would agree to is if they checked 4B4, then they have to get an inspection prior to close of escrow. The buyer acknowledges receipt of this form and, just as importantly, agrees to the applicable terms in 4B. 4B1, which is the boilerplate, says that the buyer is going to have to get proof of compliance within 1 year of close of escrow, and it's not a seller responsibility. This is where you'd want to get this worked out at the time of the offer and not halfway through the offer. And then the buyer says, gee, I'm not sure I want to take on that responsibility. By the way, if you represent a buyer and you're selling a house in Scripps Ranch, well, you might have to cut a tree down. I hope not. But if you represent a buyer out in Valley Center or something, and they're buying 4 acres, that could be thousands and thousands of dollars of land clearing. So a buyer might be well advised to consider, what the impact of bringing their property into compliance with defensible space if they're agreeing to accepting that liability. But right now, Car Legal is recommending that is probably the way most transactions should unfold, that the buyer takes on that responsibility moving forward. All right. So I think I'll pause it here, Lindsay, and ask if there's any questions. And if there are, I'll answer them. And if not, I want to cover just a couple more things real quickly and still get you out of here before noon.
There are a couple questions, Walt. The first one is from Kim. She says, so is it safe to say you should always include this disclosure regardless if it's in a high fire area?
High or very high? Yeah, I would argue that if you wanted to practice the absolute safest route, if you know your property's in a high or very high, and a TDS is required. Clearly, if a TDS is not required, then you don't need to go down this road. So you're representing a successor trustee. That's not, a TDS is not required. But the short answer to the question is, if it's in a high or very high, I would provide the form if a TDS is required, and it's 1 to 4 residential units. Again, land, no. Commercial building, no.
Okay, so Sharon Miller asks, how does the buyer obtain documentation within a year? Do they get an inspection?
Yeah, I think the buyer would call CAL FIRE or the local fire department and arrange for an inspection. That would be what the buyer would do. And I don't know how that law is going to be enforced. I mean, it is part of civil code that inspection is supposed to be obtained. But, right now there's no reporting of sales to CAL FIRE or any fire entity. So how are they going to know, I closed escrow 7 months ago. I'm running out of time. 9 months ago, 11 months ago, time to get an inspection. They're not going to know. So I wouldn't. I'm not sure that how they're going to enforce that. It is part of the civil code, though.
Darcy asks, could a buyer's agent put in the RPA offer that the seller is required to get the defensible space inspection? This would protect our buyers from dealing with getting this within a year of the purchase.
Well, you certainly could do that. I would discuss that with the buyer because that could taint the offer a little bit because the seller is going to know he's not required to do it. So why am I doing it? He might want to do it if your offer is good enough. It's certainly a discussion you want to have with the buyer that the civil code says that within 1 year of close of escrow, there's supposed to be an inspection. And the way it's currently structured on this particular offer, you, the one that's responsible, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, I could require the seller to provide it as a requirement, to close escrow. But again, that could cause a delay, cause the seller an expense. And I would tell you, if you're competing with other offers, that would probably kill your deal. It goes both ways. If I just ignored it, the unintended consequence would be the buyer ends up with a big bill 7 months from now. So you got to think about the unintended consequences in both directions.
Drew Reynolds wants to know, where do you get these compliance reports or inspection reports?
Well, you order that you can call CAL FIRE or you can call your local fire jurisdiction, and they will direct you, to who will be doing the inspection. I've only got the name of one inspector because I've only seen one report, believe it or not. So I know that entity. If you need help, call me and I'll help guide you on how to get, what kind of call to make.
Sharon Miller wants to know if you could please talk about 4B3 again.
4B3. Let me get my notes out because I want to make sure I'm on the same page as you are. 4B3. Okay, 4B3. And again, 4B3 doesn't apply for us. Why? Because there isn't a local ordinance requiring proof of compliance. But if there were such an ordinance, 4B, and it allowed either the buyer or the seller to do it, you would check 4B3, and then the buyer is the one that's going to be required to do it. So 4B3 starts out by saying, look, either one of us can do it. There is a local ordinance. It does require a report, and that ordinance allows the buyer to do it after close of escrow. And we, buyer and seller, we are going to agree that you, buyer, are the one that's going to do it. So there are some jurisdictions that have local ordinances requiring an inspection, and they do allow the buyer or the seller to do it, and they do allow the buyer to do it after close of escrow. And so that's why 4B is on the form.
Mary wants to know, wouldn't the buyer be able to order an inspection under their inspection contingency?
Great question. Absolutely not. Why? Because the RPA says that the buyer is prohibited from ordering any government inspection without the seller's approval. So that's just like there's two things that buyers sometimes want to do. And, on the face of it, you would say, well, it seems like the right thing to do. But the consequence, what's the unintended consequence? The seller is stuck with a liability he might not have had otherwise. You cannot have a building department come out and look at your property because you want to see if it complies to permits. So the seller said, I built the room addition and I didn't get permits. So the buyer said, well, I want the building department to look at it. You can't do it. It's against the contract. And the buyer could be liable for the damages that now the city comes out and says, holy cow, this isn't the code. You got to do this. You got to do that. You got to fix that. And it costs the seller 10 grand. Guess who might have to pay that? If it's a large enough dollar amount, the seller will be inclined to go after the buyer because the contract prohibits that. Same with the defensible space inspection. The buyer cannot take it upon himself to order that without the seller's permission. Now, if the seller says, yeah, you can do it, and if you're going to pay for it, yeah, go ahead and do it, and there's an agreement to that effect, call me if that's what you're going to do. I'll make sure that agreement protects whatever party we represent. But short answer to your question is the RPA prohibits a buyer from ordering any government inspections.
Vicki Barnles asked, what is the benefit of putting this in a counter if you represent a seller rather than including it with the other disclosures?
If you run the small, I would say small today, it's going to get larger over time, but you run the small risk of the buyer not agreeing to 1B. See, the default is 1B. Look, you got to get a report and you got to get one within 1 year. Have fun, enjoy. I'm heading out of state. I'm done with all the taxes. The buyer might say, wait. I don't want to get a report. I want the seller to get it. So the buyer, because this is under the TDS Civil Code 1102, the buyer has to sign this, has to agree to this. And if the buyer does not agree to it, regardless of the status of their contingencies, they get to cancel and get their money back. So you run that small risk that the buyer, real conservative, real prudent, talks to somebody, oh, no, you don't want to take responsibility for that. You want the seller to be responsible. Again, if you're selling a house in the middle of suburbs in Oceanside, I don't think it's an issue. You're selling, a couple of acres in Vista or Fallbrook or Escondido or, even in South Bay, that could be an issue. The buyer may say, wait a minute, I don't want to be responsible for this. Doesn't sign it and your deal falls apart. It's a judgment call.
Chris Vaughn says that CAL FIRE comes out to properties each year where she lives in Santa Isabel, but she's never received a report. Do you only get one if you ask for it? And would they automatically have one on file?
Well, that's a great question. If you want to email me some information, I wouldn't mind checking into that just to get some insight as to what's going on there. But if you don't have a report, you can't give what you don't have. I would argue you might want to disclose that. You might want to disclose that it's your understanding that CAL FIRE inspects the properties here once a year. I don't have a report. Buyer, can research, maybe how to get a report, or you don't even need to tell that. You don't represent the buyer. You don't need to advise the buyer. If you represent the buyer, an agent should advise them. We should check into that. But I would probably disclose that if you know they're doing inspections, even if you don't have a report.
Lisa Stadelli says, what verbiage would we put in a seller counter along with the form? And then she puts in quotes, buyer to take over responsibility of compliance of and obtaining defensible space requirement within 1 year of close of escrow.
You don't need that. The form says that. You just make the FHDS part of the contract. So on your counteroffer, you say FHDS attached herein is made a part of this agreement. And you're done.
Yolanda asks, do you have any idea how much this report costs?
That's a great question. I don't know that it's that expensive. I'm guessing it's not hundreds and hundreds. Someone know?
My client in Fallbrook got one that was free.
Free. There you go. So it's not expensive.
But that was when this form first came out.
Right. Now, yeah, and I think the concern you might have if you're concerned about dollars is cost of compliance. So if the report says, "Oh, you're not, this isn't good," then now you got to comply, and that could be a problem for you.
And then one final question, Darcy asks, can the buyer bring out their insurance company to come out during the inspection period?
Oh, that's a great question. Let me research that. That's not a government entity. I would think, yes, you could have your insurance company look at it. That may not be a bad idea, because here's what people don't often know. Insurance companies will bind anything for a month. And then they will look at your property, by the way. You may not realize this, but most insurance companies will do a drive-by on your property. That's how I got busted. They did a drive-by on my renewal, and they sent me this nasty letter. We can't renew you. And I found out that they do this all the time. We actually were contacted by an attorney, represented a buyer who we represented, and wanted us to buy 5 years worth of their homeowner's insurance. Why? Because a month after closed escrow, the insurance company sent them a bill, for what their new rate was going to be, because they discovered the property was in a very high fire zone. And so the attorney, not being a real estate attorney, not even realizing the basics of a transaction, made this great case that we failed to disclose it. It wasn't part of the TDS, and we had an obligation to blah, blah, blah. And so now you got to pay us $10,000 a year for the next 5 years. To which I sent him back to NHD that the buyer had signed, saying very high fire zone, end of problem. But here's the point of that story. That happened about 45 days after close of escrow. And when I looked into it, that particular binder gave the insurance company the right to modify the policy or cancel it within the first 60 days. I checked with my insurance guru, and he says that's on every insurance contract. It's usually, he said, 30, but some insurance companies give themselves 60 days to do that. So back to your question, would it be a good idea to have your insurance company look at it ahead of time? That might not be a bad idea. I'll check into that, but I would argue that is not a government entity. How is that different from a physical inspector, a roofing contractor, your insurance agent? How's that different? So I would think, yeah, you probably could do that.
That's it, Walt.
Okay, folks, I'm going to take a couple of minutes. I want to touch on a couple of things real fast. 3 things. I think I can do it real fast. So let me go through that. Let me go back to sharing my screen. These are issues that have come up, and I want to cover it. First of all, the real estate broker section, that's page 16 of the contract. I pulled this from the RPA class I did. Now, the buyer's agents identify themselves, of course, and they also list their email address and an ultimate address. And why is that important? Because delivery can be made when you send something to the address listed here, the email address listed here. That constitutes delivery when you hit the send. I would argue a buyer's agent writing an offer that didn't put this in would be committing malpractice. Why? Because you don't have an acceptance then until the buyer personally receives the seller's signature. See? So you can have acceptance if the principal personally receives the seller's signature. You could have acceptance if the agent personally receives the signature, the seller's signature, or you could have acceptance if the seller emails it. I wanted to make it as easy as possible for the seller to get it to me, because if I make it hard for the seller while the seller or the seller's agent is trying to figure out how to get it to me, here comes a better offer. So I hope you're following me. So I don't think any buyer's agent who pays attention is not going to provide their email address here, because they would be hurting their own cause if they didn't, their client's cause. All right. Where there might be a problem, let me zoom ahead here, is the seller's brokerage firm. And so, of course, we list who the seller's brokerage firm is, but we also give an email here. Now, the seller's agent, the buyer's agent may be filling this in. And if the buyer's agent fills this in, it may be wrong. But yet this, whatever email is here is defined. If I send something to this email address, it's deemed the seller received it. So I would, as a seller's agent, I would want to make sure this is right. So what do you do if this is left blank or not correct? There's two ways to do it. Car legal is okay with both, either one of them. Bear in mind, page 16 is after the buyer's signature. So could a listing agent cross off a wrong email address here and then put in his or her correct email address, initial it, and then sign it below? Absolutely. So that's one way to do it. You could correct it, or you could correct it in a counter offer. But I want to point that out. It's real important that, you establish correct addresses. Buyer's agents, you'd be silly not to put in the right email address. Listing agents, if they don't give you one, you're going to want to, if the buyer's agent's not going to put one in, you're going to want to put one in. And if they put a wrong one in, maybe it auto-filled from somewhere, from MLS or something, you could correct it. It's not a big deal. Never, never, never mark above a signature, but below a signature is fine. So that's the first tip. The other tip I want to talk about is when you are selling a property that is tenant occupied at the time of acceptance. This is very important. We've had a couple of problems, near misses. That's the good news. I think near misfits. I don't know. We wiggled out of the problem, but it could have been serious. So I want to remind you about this. So part of the RPA, paragraph 4, you can include specific addenda for the types of transactions you're in that might be different than a regular old run-of-the-mill, transaction. So if you're selling a property that is tenant occupied at the time the offer is accepted, include the TOP. Now, the reason I bring this up is I had more than one agent tell me, "Oh no, the tenant's moving out, so the buyer tends to live in the property, and so this doesn't apply." Oh no, it absolutely applies. So the form, it's a 2-page form actually, and I want to get quickly to the part that the boilerplate says the tenant will remain in possession. That's the boilerplate. No, the buyer wants possession, and the seller is given the seller has given the tenant notice. Okay, great. Then check 1B. And 1B, especially if you're the listing agent, 1B does allow for the property to be vacant. But here's the important thing. If the seller, after exercising a good faith attempt to get the tenant out and can't, then the buyer can cancel this agreement. Well, of course, the buyer is going to be a buyer occupant, and the buyer's sole remedy is the cost, out-of-pocket cost for their inspections and appraisals. Absent 1B being checked, and not even using this form, just writing on a counter offer, that the tenant agrees to move out. Well, you can't bind the tenant. I've talked about this in the past. He's not part of the contract. So failure to do this could put a seller in a world of pain if they can't get the tenant out, but yet they were obligated to provide the possession to the buyer at close of escrow. The fact that the tenant intends to move out doesn't necessarily help you. So, the rest of the form is pretty straightforward and won't take any time. The last tip I'll give you, and then we'll wrap it up. Repair requests. This happens frequently. So here's a tip. Listing agents, tell your sellers not to do any repairs until the buyer provides either an appropriate contingency removal or a removal of all contingencies. And I would argue all contingencies. Why? Because this happens all the time. The seller makes repairs, the buyer still has contingencies left, the buyer cancels, and the seller wants to know who's paying for the repairs I would have never made if the buyer hadn't asked for them. that probably comes up at least once a month, at least. And it can sometimes be ugly. We had a deposit over $30,000 tied up over a couple of $1,000 dispute. The seller wanted $2,000 they spent on making repairs. The buyer correctly said, I'm entitled to my entire deposit back. I had not removed any contingencies. And it took a bit of doing to get the seller to finally see that, because the contingencies weren't removed, the buyer was in their right to demand the whole deposit. What didn't come up in that debate with the parties was that our agent might not have told the seller, and they might have. The seller claims that they had no clue. I didn't get into the weeds there, but in writing, you should advise your sellers not to perform repairs until contingency removal has been provided to the seller. Okay, I wanted to talk about those three things. Thanks for joining me today. I hope I answered a few questions.